Okay, I don't know if you're going to love me, hate me for this, whatever. But as a starting point for everybody, I've written what interacting with Adam, what has come to be referred to between the two of us as the treatise. Okay, it's kind of like our rhombun. It is no shorter than, what is it, with a slight editing, it was 1,941 words. So we've been saying 2,000 words was where we were at. So I think it may have just hit the 2,000 mark. Okay, so it's 4 full pages. Okay, 4 full pages. Okay, every line in it matters. Okay, but the lines that matter most will be the final page, the campus in communications, and your task. Now, I should say don't be intimidated, but no, please be intimidated. Okay, this is a starting point that everyone needs to really carefully engage with. But the reason why I've done this is just simply to make it easier for you. What I've done here is effectively to write 1,500 words, first of all, on the history of universities, okay? Where they're coming from, the logics of them, and particularly the logic of the university campus. Originally, we pulled together a bunch of links and thought of just getting people to work through the links. But what we know is that some students will really embrace that, others won't. So there would be a very deep, asymmetry of engagement with the materials. And it would have required people to do a fair bit of thinking and work to kind of make the connections. And whenever there is ambiguity, there tends to be slippage, okay, in terms of intent. So we thought the best thing to do was to have a very clear statement of the context that people can read, really get a sense of the origins of the notion, the concept of the university, and how that relates to the notion of a campus. I'm going to reference a couple of examples here. I will be making another short presentation, pre-recording it, I think. Time permits. You can see there's a whole pile of stuff behind me, which is still for a couple of branding videos I still need to shoot for Introduction to Business. It's just been work, and not getting back in here to do the video on that. So I need to get that done first. But I want to speak to several of the key points. We draw a key distinction around the notion of the campus as communication, the campus for communication, and the campus in communication. This distinction will be very important. Now, we also have the overarching title of the task as the campus as communication. And when we draw this distinction, it takes on a slightly narrower meaning in this particular document. But the critical first point here is that the very creation of a university, or the expansion of a commitment to a university by a government, by a host society, whatever, is a very strong communicative act in its own right. What we see is that nations that became newly independent, when they're establishing their national institutions, they all needed a central bank, they all needed some key institutions such as the Department of Foreign Affairs. They need a national health system. They typically create a national museum, national art gallery. And of course, all new societies got to thinking too about having their own university. And so it became a significant part of a nation or regional development project, sometimes a very explicit signal about integrating a region into the nation. And I mention very particularly in this text, the now famous case of Lund University in the town Lund. Some of you know it. A couple of you may have been destined to go there, and hopefully you're keeping an eye on your correspondence from Waseda in relation to study abroad. There's a set of issues there which are interesting. But in the case of Lund, Denmark and Sweden, which have long beating each other up, but now you know, very much friendly rivals within a broader Nordic identity, linguistically, and all very, very close, of course, Danish and Swedish. But some of the most intense historical rivalries were by near neighbors. And at one point, Sweden became extremely strong. Sweden was, in fact, kind of a dominant power in Northern Europe for a while. And if you look at the history, and we will give you a link on some of the oldest universities, we'll see that some of the oldest universities in the Nordic states were given strong encouragement when they were under rule by Sweden. And these days, they're in places like Estonia and Finland and even northern Germany and what they're all part of the Swedish Empire. So when Sweden was at its zenith, it took the area of Scania from the Kingdom of Denmark, which is just across the strait. And as a very strong signal of Swedish commitment to the region, in the cathedral town of Lund, it established a university on the site of an old school, which was attached to the cathedral before it was Catholic, and then came the Protestant Reformation and whatnot. So it was a very strong commitment of resources to the building the university, partly emphasizing the civilizing role of the Swedish king and all the rest of it, but to create a powerful institution of learning. But we see also that although universities became strong statements of the prestige and the wisdom of rulers historically, they weren't very narrow nationalistic institutions. One of the key organizing principles, indeed, what actually qualified something as a university in medieval times with the oldest universities, and then later on, was that quite explicitly they were open to students from outside the local society, outside the region, the kingdom, or, you know, it's not accurate to talk necessarily about the nation until rather later. So creating universities themselves and resourcing universities has become a very strong symbolic, more meaningful act. It's a very strong act of communication by various stakeholders, whether it's a private foundation, individuals, for example. Stanford University was funded by a very wealthy railway baron called Stanford, okay? In honor, he and his wife first created it in honor of their only child, their young son, who died tragically very young, and they were deeply traumatized by the loss of their son, and decided to direct pretty much all of their personal wealth into the creation of a university. So these are very strong communicative acts, and this is still the case today. Cities often try and draw a university campus, maybe a branch campus, or get the university even to fully relocate into a site within their city as a catalyst for urban renewal. And one instance, and I'll show a little bit more about this later on, not today, but probably in a video, or at least through some available materials, is a very striking case in the middle of Jerusalem with an interesting Japanese angle. So Jerusalem unified under Israeli rule since 1967, but still contentious and a lot of fault lines, right smack bang right in the middle of the city, in an area which was quite close to the old dividing line, but right next to the city hall, in a site that was once a Russian compound for Russian pilgrims, and Rasputin and many other prominent people, including Russian aristocrats, went there and whatever. Anyway, this site, there's been a long debate about what to do with this site in central Jerusalem. So the city, with national backing, has decided to create a new campus for Israel's oldest Academy of Arts and Design, Bezalel Academy, and to bring that into the heart of the city. And quite explicitly, they are saying that the nature of the institution, of the student and the faculty members they will attract will be a significant catalyst, not just for economic renewal of the city, but cultural renewal. And there's a lot of very strong identity conflicts and rivalries in Jerusalem, as you imagine. It's not just a center for multiple religious faiths. Of course, Al-Aqsa and Dome of the Rock are absolutely critical, key institutions, key sites, religious sites for Muslims. That's where we believe Muhammad ascended into heaven. Unfortunately, it's right on top of the old Temple Mount that was originally built thousands of years ago by Jews, and the only remaining area is the Western Wall. So inherently, it's a very contentious space. And so our news tends to focus very much on those religious rivalries. Of course, then you've got Christians as well, and something like 23 different Christian denominational identities historically were often very brutal to each other in Jerusalem as well, even though they were usually minority players until the late 19th century. But then the 20th century, particularly with Jewish migration in the interwar period and then after World War II, after the Holocaust in Europe and whatnot, Jerusalem attracted a lot of secular, cosmopolitan, typically intellectuals who had left Europe, often fled Nazi Europe, for example, and settled in Jerusalem. And at an earlier stage, the Bezalel Academy had been established there back in 1907 as well. But over time, the religious dynamics have become so intense in the Jerusalem context that many of the more secular cosmopolitan individuals made Tel Aviv their home, and Jerusalem was this very contested sectarian space. There have been very strong endeavors by the city government, various politicians, to try and rebalance Jerusalem, to get away from, in a sense, the curse of its sacredness. And so one key mechanism for this was to sing this Bezalel Academy, which had several campuses in the city, to bring them together, first of all, to unify them, the different faculties. Architecture is in one place, jewelry design, fine arts are in another place, for example, photography is in another place, to bring them all together into one campus, to cross-fertilize and interdisciplinary kind of dynamics, communication, which is something I'll come back to in a moment, but also to really change the whole cultural dynamics of the inner city of Jerusalem. One of the very symbolic things they did was actually commissioned renowned Japanese architectural firm Sana, Sejima-san and Ishizawa-san, the key partners, the founding partners. And they're very famous, and we'll see in a moment when we talk about the physicality and spatiality. Their architecture is very famous for adhering to the form of a landscape and being wrapped in glass. If anyone's been to the Kanazawa Museum of the 21st century, the art gallery there in Kanazawa City, you know exactly their work. So this was an extraordinarily controversial thing to do, to actually bring a glass encased building into the center of the city, because for well over 100 years, the rules in Jerusalem have said that every building must be faced in stone. Now, stone it's cooling. It's obviously very historical. It's Jerusalem stone. It gives a coherence to the city. We'll talk about this in a moment, the role of facades and the coherence of the urban experience when there are things like common codes to create a very distinctive signature. If you walk the streets of different Italian cities, for example, you'll know exactly where you are, whether you're in Siena or Bologna or whatever, just simply by the different architectural feel. In contrast, in Japan, unless you get some kind of cheeky ginko no kanban or something, if someone knocked you on the head and dumped you in a suburb, pretty much anywhere in Japan, you'd have a hard time knowing where you were because of the remarkable similarity of the urban environment. But so back in the Jerusalem case, to have a building wrapped in glass, actually, it was a very controversial thing. It's so common in other places, but it took on very significant political meaning. The notion of a building being transparent, that people can look in and can look out. It looks out upon the city, and the city can look in upon Jerusalem, the art school. And given the political rivalries and identity issues are always so contentious, and a tradition ever since the Bible, David and Goliath, a tradition of throwing stones at people you don't like. Okay, a building made in glass is potentially security-wise a perilous thing as well. So the very form of the building, the siting of the building, the very nature of bringing the campus into the center of the city has very strong communicative, symbolic meanings. This is before we even start to talk about how the building functions. So the second part of what we will talk about in here, and it's all very clearly written, is the campus for communication. And while I'm on the Betzelder Academy case, a very clear brief that was given by the Academy to Sana, the Japanese architects, was that the form of the building must facilitate, catalyze even, stimulate communications amongst people in the university who don't normally communicate, okay? So people in different disciplinary areas. And the text I've written here very significantly develops this point, that the old medieval universities were very small in scale. Lund University, for the first 100 years, each year typically had about 200 students. So we're talking about very, very tiny institutions, not necessarily completely elite either, in the sense that super smart poor people could be there, you know, with scholarships because there were benefactors, you know, wealthier people who wanted to support the greatest, you know, the cultivation of the greatest minds, you know, of the time, or the greatest potential scientists of the time, or whatnot. But as universities have become larger in scale, and as the field of specialist knowledge has become so huge, we have seen simultaneous developments of the upscaling of the university with the number of students. The spatiality, of course, has been significantly upscaled. But then also the organization of knowledge into subfields, which is then mirrored in education. So we see, for example, the rise in the late 19th, early 20th, particularly in the early 20th century, the major system. And there's always been a tension in universities between generalist education and highly specialist education. You know, of Sills is extreme in a sense of completely generalist if you want it to be. You can kind of DIY your major, and we now have a concentration system. Not so many people are actually kind of using that, but there is a chance for you to make your own major. Now, actually, a lot of universities have kind of moved this way, but still have formal major systems. Stanford was one of the early pioneers on this, but interestingly, Stanford, although all students had to declare a major at the beginning, it was only something like 30 of the 120 credits actually went to the major. So the rest of it were general courses. And so there's always been a tension. But once you create major systems, they tend to be linked to departments, and academics have particular identities. They join academic associations associated with this narrow disciplinary identity. And over time, these have become very, very hard. It's quite unusual for academics to cross these disciplinary divides, maybe unless in their research activities. So they tend to be very narrow, very structured. I first knew Professor Johns through being in the School of Marketing and International Business, which was then considered too much, and the university split them into two, separate School of Marketing, separate School of International Business, at Queensland University of Technology back in Australia, where I was an academic for a while. So very narrow identities. And it's become so extreme in many universities that, for example, this is one reason why I came to Sills very deliberately. It was a chance for me to cross boundaries because I was always very multidisciplinary in orientation. In Australian universities now, typically if you work in the marketing school, you're given a list of journals and conferences and whatnot that they will support you doing research aimed at, you know, funding to travel to those conferences, and other things, no. You're really forced to be very narrow. And so a whole lot of things, the architecture quite literally of it, that when I was at Queensland University of Technology, it was a widespread joke, but I think there was an absolute truth in it, that they abolished one school just simply because the new building that people moved into, Z Block, okay, it's been there for quite a while now, had one fewer floor than the total number of departments. So they needed to make people fit into the architecture. The other thing typically happens when universities are expanding and they can afford new architecture, every department of every school gets their own particular building and the students go in there and they do their major there and whatnot. And so the opportunities to actually interact with people, whether it's faculty members or students from a different area, are very limited. One of the interesting things that make Japanese universities, I think, quite a distinctive kind of campus and student experience is the phenomenon of the sakura, which explicitly is cutting across faculty divides. So you get to meet a bunch of people across different faculties, different fields of study. Arguably, the one thing in common you've all got is none of you are studying very much. I hope that's not true. Okay, we could debate that endlessly. That has been widely seen to be a very valuable feature of Japanese universities. And arguably, when you talk to students about, what are they looking forward to with university, very often the field of study figures far less prominently than the campus and the social life. And it's a chicken and egg kind of thing. This then mirrors what happens in human resource management going out into the world of work. Specialist knowledge has been less valued in the Japanese context than in many other places. And so there's been less demand for highly specialist knowledge. It will be interesting to see whether that changes over time. Arguably, Japan, precisely because it has fewer of those structural rigidities, in some respects, may be more able to embrace multidisciplinarity, people communicating across disciplinary divides. That's the theory. That's what every university since the 1970s has been talking about. But there's a lot of physical and organizational and mental structural rigidities. Okay, and so when we think about the campus and the campus experience, it's inseparable from the history of the rise of the universities, mass participation in universities and mass scaling up that have really changed the whole dynamics. These days, most university students in the world live in cities, go to city-based campuses. They're not in ideal, rural, remote designed campuses, a la the University of Virginia, which was the first designed campus, and it was designed by Thomas Jefferson, of all people. Up until Jefferson, we tended to see that the campus devolved kind of organically, typically in an urban context. If it was a small urban context, the university grew to the point where it swamped everything else in the city, and we come to refer to the towns as university towns. So Lund has that property, and we see plenty of other places that do as well throughout the world. Ann Arbor, for example, with the University of Michigan is another example that I mentioned there. Now, what's striking is that universities for decades have been talking about trying to break down some of these rigidities to create or recreate the campus as a space of communications. The very notion of education, of course, has been predicated on communication. Professors very often talking at students. I wish it was more of an interactive kind of dialogue, but very much a communicative kind of model. And to get people talking across disciplinary divides has been only a slow thing. One of the interesting things which strangely COVID and going online has actually reaffirmed rather than undermined is that professors are far more likely to be in frequent interaction in conversation with like-minded professors and researchers in their own disciplinary areas, in their own fields of research, than they are with people in different fields in the neighboring building or in building 11, one floor down. I have for years been teaching corporate governance, for example, and explicitly referencing the work of one scholar who's a pretty famous guy in writing about Japanese corporate governance. In fact, he and I both had chapters in a book way back in about 2001, and I met him, spent a fair bit of time with him over a 2-day workshop once that led to the production of the book. I then, a couple of years later, moved to Waseda. And believe it or not, I met him face to face for the first time in 2019 in the elevator. So I'd been here, I think, 8 years. No, many more, many years more than that. I came here in 2004, for goodness sake, before I actually had spoken with him directly face to face. Partly inertia on my, it's me, Jim Sensei, partly inertia on my part, kept meaning to pop down and bang on the door and say hi. Been in this building since 2009, and yeah, it was 10 years before we finally actually kind of ran into each other, which is a particularly embarrassing and an extreme kind of instance, you might think, but it is remarkably frequent. When I was doing stuff with the CIE, Center of International Education, I don't know how many times I met very interesting Japanese or foreign Waseda colleagues from other faculties for the very first time when I was participating in meetings with foreign visitors. You know, it's often said, you know, unless you actually have foreign visitors, you don't talk to your own colleagues. And I've even done a kind of a machiawase, meeting Japanese colleagues I'd never met in my life for the first time at international venues before, as representatives of Waseda, we met people on the other side. In fact, in one particular instance, I'm meeting representatives from Australian universities, all of who I knew very well personally, and it was, I had to do a hajime mashite kind of, you know, otogane jiko shokai to my fellow Waseda colleagues before I could introduce them to the Australian side, all of whom I knew well. So, of course, when we move towards online teaching, online research collaboration, all these kind of things, there's virtual communications, this can significantly compound this, you know. Here I am in my office talking to you guys, wherever you are, was just dropping in. I joked I was Zoom bombing the Sophia folks. Half of them in the classroom, half of them spread all over the world, just like the SILS experience. So this leads to some really profound questions about how we can think about the nature of the campus. Its original spatial rationales can now, in terms of facilitating active communication, can be done even more easily these days, virtually. The only thing that works against, you know, being constantly collaborating with people on the other side of the earth is the time difference. And if you've got bizarre sleeping habits like I have, then that's, you know, absolutely no problem. I was in LSE workshop. When was that, last Thursday night, that kicked off at 3:30 in the morning, watched the kind of the sun come up. And I got a sense, oh, the world really is round, because the key speaker, a very prominent professor, former LSE professor, was coming from San Francisco, and it was a beautiful day there. And it was mid-evening in London. They'd scheduled it to get people after work, and a godforsaken time out in the Pacific, where people like myself were, and people joining from Australia and other places. So the third component then becomes the campus in communication, okay? And this is where your task will be centered. So I explicitly say in the text, although it would be very nice to have you in a very design thinking-esque kind of way, deeply ideating about how to create a meaningful new campus design, physical campus design, to get you to come on campus and stay on campus. You know, so the purpose of the campus of the physical campus in a virtual age, we would love you to really develop that and present some grand plan to Waseda and say, now go and do some huge fundraising and bring a lot of money and, you know, fix everything about Waseda's spatiality so that we stay on campus. We'd like to do that. We're not going to do that, okay? However, it is nonetheless important to start thinking in those terms, and particularly to look at some leading examples of universities that are doing this. And Stanford is a very striking one. And I'll have links for you very specifically on Stanford. Interestingly, Stanford has been doing this, thinking about this, since well before COVID. And this has actually been driven by the D School that we've already seen. You've already looked at materials from the D School. It's not surprising they turned their own attention with design thinking to Stanford experience of selves, because, they are in very close collaboration with Silicon Valley. David Kelly, for example, key founding individual for the D School and co-founder of IDEO. One of his key clients, of course, has long been Apple from the very early days. So they are just every day thinking about what's the meaning of a space. Why are we in super expensive Silicon Valley? San Francisco downtown. Why do we have this Stanford campus? Why do we require all undergraduates to live on the campus, for example? Fortunately, they've got so much money that if you can't afford to, they give you the money to do that. So there is an accommodation guarantee because they've got the cash. So they're at the forefront of really thinking meaningfully about not just the campus experience, but the curriculum as a whole. And so one of the things I was doing over the weekend was pulling together a kind of kit of materials. And then that was the prompt from on Saturday. I thought, no, I'm going to have to write this, because if I just give this material to you, you're going to be overwhelmed. Because it turned out that the D School did such an elaborate process in thinking about the future of the campus in a virtual age. I was quite nice that I read that they described it like that, because actually research credit I have, the rationale was explicitly that. And I found out that Stanford belatedly, I belatedly found out, they'd used exactly the same words. But they have two major reports, documents, and very interesting links. And I will share the links with you, but they're a bit overwhelming. They run the 200 pages, okay? They had something like 1,000 individuals have input over 2 years. But what is really interesting in the Stanford case is that fundamental to Stanford's own story now is how they're engaged in an ongoing exploratory endeavor to figure out how they make the campus experience continually meaningful. And so we're going to see not just the Stanford case, but several other cases. I particularly will be profiling Aalto in Finland, in Helsinki, which is, they've had several campuses. There were in fact several institutions that have then been consolidated on one major campus, one of the key campuses for one of their institutions. And the text talks about this, that they made a very conscious decision to co-locate their design school and their business school. And this has been influential. Other institutions are looking at this. I will be sharing another link with you, which kind of summarizes some of the recent developments in US universities thinking about the role of the campus. And the Stanford model and the Aalto model is being very influential. And the summary statement of it was, universities increasingly are trying to think of every faculty being a D school. They're trying to bring a design component into their pedagogical, their teaching practice and whatnot, and their content. But it's not just because people should know about design, but it's more about the way that designers work, the kind of the collaborative, iterative nature of design work, and a recognition that the existing spatialities of universities don't very much support that. The relatively new classrooms we have here in Building 11 have generally an inherent design problem in that they are all predicated on, I would say 19th century, but no, 11th century, an 11th century model of education, really. 19th century in terms of large scale. The chairs are sprung in such a way that they force you to sit up straight and face the front, right? It's just like that grumpy teacher in school. You know, I stood up front, sit up straight. Well, literally the furniture, which is bolted to the floor, compels you to do this. And those of you who are already taking the introduction to business class as well too, and you have to do group work down there and in the building there and in the class, and we're on the 5th floor there. You find that this is just an inherent problem. How do you actually turn around and do group work when all it's rows and you're all eyes to the front? It's predicated completely on a one-way delivery. You watch the Poker-chan show, or you just fall asleep or whatever. Okay, just like you're doing now, but at least you have the comfort of being in your track decks or being able to, you know, walk around with your buds in and make yourself a coffee and listen to me while I'm talking or whatever. But you don't have that there. You just, you know, the worst kind of educational kind of boot camp. So institutions everywhere recognize this, but you can't simply reconfigure your architecture because universities everywhere are facing financial constraints. It is universities such as Stanford that have huge amounts of money that can afford to do this. Aalto is a particularly interesting case. The Finnish economy is booming, very strong startup culture and whatnot. But also in terms of Finland's own national self-identity as a design superpower and as an innovative economy with one of the highest rates of startups, embracing the identity of Alvar Aalto, one of the foremost modernist architects, particularly from the well, his work earlier from the 1930s, but particularly influential from the 50s and 60s. And I'm sure many of you know Aalto's work. See my service from his show poster. Okay, Alvar Aalto. Okay, and he and his then wife, I know, made vases and a whole bunch of things. So I've got, I want to start showing you my Aalto furniture from home. But they took 3 different institutions and they unified them into one institution. The government found some special money for it, okay, including for some better architecture. The Aalto had done some of the campus plans where they're being consolidated, the site they're consolidated on, and made the most beautiful lecture theatres I have ever been in my life. And I will actually share some pictures of this in a slide presentation. Just breathtakingly beautiful. We see that several Japanese architects have gone to Aalto and they've given lectures there. And the first thing I always start off is like they're just looking in awe, you know, like they're in the temple of design. And the privilege of undergraduates to sit in that kind of space is incredibly inspiring. So leveraging Aalto's identity as a designer on this campus space that he had been critical to building in the first place, and then consolidating business and the design school together in a new building influenced by Aalto's modernist principles, is a very strong symbolic gesture, a very strong communicative act, which resources could be committed to. And it's an act by the institution, it's an act by government stakeholders, by the academics themselves involved in the process. As an aside, Finns are almost pathologically open. You know, I invited myself along to talk to them about what they were doing at relatively short notice because I was at a conference in Finland, and 24 hours notice, basically. I said, oh, I'm thinking I'll just come by the campus and have a look. Do you mind? Could I get permission? I found myself the next day at a faculty reception for the start of the new semester, talking to the vice president, the deans and whatnot. And they said, look, if you'd like to come in and do a study of what we're doing here, you'd be very, very welcome. You know, we're all publicly funded. Anyone has access to this. All the information is available. You're very welcome. And oh, have some food, have some wine. Okay, fantastic. Then, of course, COVID came and bang, and all that's kind of, you know, been put on hold, which has been you know, extraordinarily frustrating, even though I have actually a research grant for the future of university campus in a era of higher education, virtuality and marketization. So yeah, the things that get disrupted. But I kept thinking, in contrast, the challenges that would be involved for someone outside the university to get access to Waseda. If someone had written somebody saying, hey, I'm going to be in Tokyo tomorrow, can I come by? You would not suddenly find yourself talking to all of the key stakeholders and being involved and being invited to sit in on meetings or interview people or even shoot video with people and all of these kind of things. So openness is a mindset. It's a set of values, but it's also something that is manifested and reinforced in terms of the design of a campus, the aspirations for a campus, and the communicative gestures that institutions and their host society want to make actually through campus in the first place. So what are you guys going to be doing? Okay, you'll be able to read this document and get it. The key thing you're going to be doing is you're actually going to be doing what's Aaron James Draplin, the hugely interesting Oregon-based graphic designer we're going to look at later in the semester, he refers to as kind of, he calls it Junkin, where he's a brilliant graphic designer. What he does is his spare time, he's working all the time, but what he mostly does in his spare time is he's going around deceased estate sales, people selling off the contents of grandma's house or whatever, going to secondhand stores, going to flea markets and whatnot, and just looking for the traces of American graphic design history. And I have a great pile of my own collection, a whole bunch of things over here. Vast array of things I could hold up and show you. Okay. And that here is his sources of inspiration. So he's very much scrapbooking fundamentally, and in this process he does like some mood boarding and whatnot. He just finds things that really, really influence him, constant sources of influence. So in some sense, you're going to be doing something similar. You will be explicitly seeking out historically, as well as in a contemporary sense, how representations of the campus and the campus experience, and it's multiple campuses in the Waseda case, have been made by the university and by third parties. So how has Waseda figured in mass media, in broader media content, in content created by, say, cultural industries, but of course, first and foremost, how Waseda has been depicted by itself over time. Okay. Now, Waseda has very rich resources that you can dip into in the physical space of the library. Of course, if you're completely remote, then you can't do that. But maybe even for a couple of the online groups, there may be, because a number of people are kind of COVID concerned rather than stuck abroad, but they may be comfortable coming into the library, maybe not. I will be flexible with people on that. But there's also enormous resources of materials digitally that are available, and so you can do this remotely. So you're going to be doing the equivalent to some degree of scrapbooking. You can be looking at both visual and textual representations of Waseda University. Okay, and you will be arriving at, well, first of all, you'll be going through a kind of sense-making process, a sorting kind of process of, categorization, subcategorization, effectively engaging in a semiotic analysis. So what are coming up with some understanding about, what are kind of common themes, in terms of representations of campus and the campus experience broadly defined. How have they changed over time? And then trying to situate them in Waseda's own self-understandings, okay? What can we discern about how Waseda understands itself and wants to be understood historically and today and in a future-oriented kind of way through the depictions it presents of the campus. So there's a lot of that kind of collecting, interpreting, classifying, and then very concisely summarizing and presenting in the form of a presentation. So this is the kind of thing that market researchers do, that branding researchers do. That good friend of mine, for example, has a branding consultancy. He does a lot of it very much centered in a semiotic analysis, that when he has clients, for example, and he's had two major clients who are very much interested in the coffee industry and coffee culture in Japan, that he did a very thorough exploration of representations of coffee and coffee culture throughout Japan, from traditional kind of kisaten, the chain stores, artisanal coffee, the korowari kind of culture, coffee maniac culture, right through to the phenomena of, Jiro Hambaiki, Kan Kohi, and the narrative, the textual and visual narrative strategies around selling canned coffee, for example, and coming up with a very sophisticated summary of how coffee has been represented in the Japanese context. Well, you're going to do a similar kind of thing, but very specifically about Waseda. There's going to be a lot of implied comparison in the sense that you need some reference points, and I will be talking further about this with some key hints in terms of sense making, the very particular and the broader, backwards and forwards in a very D-school kind of way. So by understanding what other institutions have done, and that's why I'm pointing you towards some examples, this will help you to sharpen your focus, to know what to be looking for in a very particular Waseda context. And so there will be very clear links back in terms of your working habits to the descriptions we heard from those great icons of writing about copywriting, Webb Young and David Ogilvy, both of whom say that you have to do a really quite exhaustive deep dive into the whole history of a particular industry and the stories it tells about itself, how various players in the market and products have been presented. Well, we do a similar kind of thing. So you need that broader context then to be able to make sense of Waseda. You'll be coming to one initial big judgment, a difficult judgment, maybe a painful judgment to make, maybe it'll be a happy judgment. And that will be how authentic has Waseda been in its communications, over time. Has Waseda just been bollocksing on for a century? Or, has Waseda genuinely been presenting the campus and campus experience in ways that are actually recognizable to people who've had that experience in the first place, okay? Or is there a huge gap, okay? Now, there's always an element in organizations of aspirational communications, a little bit of kind of fake it till you make it, or at least declare that you're going to be something and then become it, okay? And so this is a key thing in branding. And those of you taking the Introduction to Business, the set of slides talks from last week talks very specifically about this, that branding obviously focuses on perceived images, how we are perceived and how we want to be perceived as a company, as a product, and all the rest of it. But it actually is something much more expansive too. It's really about, are you what you say you are? Are you becoming what you say you are or want to be? Okay. And if not, do you need to change? Well, you should be kind of changing your story. You should be trying to close the gap. It's helpful to make a distinction here between marketing and branding in this sense. Marketing historically has just been understood by a lot of people, I think wrongly, too narrowly, as you've got an existing firm and a set of products, and it's about really getting about the price and the distribution, the selling right, okay? Something that you add, kind of ex post. Of course, the 4 Ps, this expansive notion of marketing that, what is the product in the first place, implies, of course, that the whole product development process is a key part of marketing. And so that has led marketing to become much more expansive and be focused on information, deep information about customer insights and whatnot. Branding in a fundamental sense, yes, there's information about how we're perceived, but branding is really more fundamentally about, what are we, what do we understand ourselves, what do we want to be, where do we want to be, are we seen in that kind of way, how can we better project our brand story. And so authenticity is absolutely critical to brand sustainability. Short term, you might be able to get away with some kind of dodgy upsell, okay? And that's a very short-term tactical, more marketing or selling kind of thing. But branding actually presents this really profound challenge to the individual, to the institution, to become what you say you are or what you want to be, okay? So you'll be asking that really big question, but then there's a set of supplementary interesting questions about what attributes do we discern and there'll be a list of them here. And this will be looking very specifically at communications and the depiction of the campus and the campus experience in communications. And it'll be, you know, things that come to mind here I've got on the list, okay. Originality, okay. So in fact, let me read the list I've got here so that I quite consistent, okay. And in terms of adjectives, and I say here, they imply measures of attributes expressed as adjectives, such as original, visionary, evocative. You know, how much does picture of the campus actually evoke a reaction? My brother in architecture school had a very famous professor who later on went and designed a house for my mum and dad, which they eventually sold and moved away from because they wanted to live in another place, but I've always missed the house. What a pity, because it was such a wonderful house. And anyway, but he was very famous. Professor Peter O'Gorman was very famous. He'd walk in and he would just look at something, a student's design or whatever, in a classic critique, the classic crit or whatever, or third-party work, and he would just simply say, fails to evoke. And this is burned into my brain. It's become part of the discourse of in my family. I think anyone who had a family member who was educated by Professor O'Gorman, that fails to evoke. Yeah, it's kind of there. It's kind of, you know, it's adequate. Maybe it meets all the functional imperatives, but it just simply fails to evoke something emotionally in you, okay? And in this era of information and, you know, overload and attention scarcity, there's probably, you know, nothing more fatal. I guess in KonMari terms, there's no tokimeki, not feeling the tokimeki, okay? So is there some tokimeki, okay, with Waseda, whether it's communications? We need to ask ourselves, you know, is it dignified? I think this notion of dignified is a critical thing with universities, particularly when we've understood ourselves historically in competition with Kale, who managed to get themselves in the 7 o'clock news last night saying that everyone's going to get vaccinated, including Hijolkin, but I don't count because actually I finished up officially as Hijolkin at Keio on Sangatsu 31 Nichi. So Waseda better get on with it. Although mind you, I must say, I'm very troubled by the idea of Daikigyo and large universities getting a head start on vaccinating their own people when there are still ambulance officers who haven't been vaccinated, when there's lots of otoshigori, when there's lots of frontline workers. From a communications point of view, the government seems to have just thrown out the most fundamental principle of priority, you know, vaccination on the basis of needs. In the end of in the pursuit of a desperate desire to get as many people vaccinated as possible, a numbers game, and some arguably in some sense some collective immunity. But throwing out something that has just been vital to the acceptance of a vaccination program in the United States. Even when the US government worked with large companies to vaccinate their employees, it was very much on the understanding that more vulnerable people got it before less vulnerable people. And of course, big companies in Japan, Nanawari was supposed to be doing Zaitaku Kima, right? Work from home. So, with the most yoyu. So anyone in Chusho Kigyo has, I think, a very understandable desire to be pretty annoyed that a bunch of folks at Waseda are going to get it before a bunch of frontline workers who are in their maybe 60s or 70s vulnerable. I would have thought the dignity of Kea would have said that actually we're not, our first priority will be vaccinating the vulnerable rather than our healthy people. But anyway, particularly because they run a hospital, which I live down the street from, but anyway. Which kind of walk through at the moment, actually, which is nothing, but anyway. So other kind of properties: engaging, persuasive, seriousness, and then there's scope for you to come up with a whole bunch of other properties. You know, you might want fun, okay, whatever properties you think are appropriate and desirable in the communications of a university. And then a final point, of course, is you'll need to keep in mind that universities speak to many constituencies. You cannot just simply see this through the prism of being a student. For a start, the vast majority of you, I know there are a few notable exceptions, but the vast majority of you are not paying for your education yourself, okay? So universities speak to parents and anyone else who provides the funding. In countries where the government provides all the funding, the primary constituency for university communications, of course, is governments and anyone who influences public opinion, because governments are influenced by public opinion. But of course, universities, because it takes up so much of people's time, okay, resources, they have to, in some sense, offer a promise, a return, a payoff. This is not gimmick, right? So, and yet this is what so many people want to do. It's because collectively universities have established a value proposition for students. We take so much of this for granted, particularly when we have a status hierarchy and whatnot. But, you know, frankly, if it's just about hanging out with people and doing fun stuff, there are a lot cheaper ways to do that for 4 years than coming to the university. So clearly universities are offering a bunch of other things. One reason why parents are prepared to pay so much money, as I did for my own daughter at Waseda, it took longer than she should have, which cost me even more, okay? And had to sell my Nintendo shares, which is one of the worst things I ever did timing-wise. But anyway, that's what you do for your kids. So parents are prepared to pay because they see longer-term returns for their kids. Obviously, the branding resource is something that you can then take into the workplace, and you at very least maybe get more secure employment, hopefully more prosperous employment or whatever. I'd love to think the parents pay for universities just simply because they make their darlings more educated and wiser and nicer people. Yeah, I hope that's true, but I suspect not. But anyway, so universities are talking to a lot of constituencies. And what that means is that there's a great danger in just being cool or confronting or edgy, for example, because although you might wow a bunch of students, you might alienate a bunch of other critical constituencies, particularly if universities are chasing things like significant donations. You know, some very wealthy person, you know, bequeaths a huge amount of money to an institution. They can absolutely transform the finances, the potentiality, the strategic direction of an institution. And there are some cases of universities that have got so much money, they literally struggle to know what to do with it, okay? An incredible position to be in. This is one reason why by the way, why universities overwhelmingly are organized on a not-for-profit basis, even when you're private universities, for the very simple reason that generally wealthy people don't donate money to for-profit endeavors. So something that's not for profit, people are prepared to do things for the institution on their own time, for free, and prepared to give their own money. There are some interesting kind of exceptions, you know. Masada-san, founder of Steyr, for example, you know, he is very generous with his own money or his own pocket for scholarships of students at Digital Hollywood University, for example, which is technically a for-profit institution, but because he's absolutely committed to promoting the development of content creators in Japan. So he's got a very personal kind of vision there. So the for-profit motivation doesn't completely exclude those kind of motivated benefactors, but it's much less likely to be the case. So the very need to actually speak as an institution which is in some sense aiming to be timeless and other regarding, societally regarding, puts very heavy constraints on what you can do in terms of your communications, requires you to speak to a range of other constituencies the business is maybe less directly concerned with. So it has particular communication challenges, but it's also quite an exciting kind of prospect. And then it raises really interesting questions about the whole nature of the campus and the spatiality of the campus. And there's a powerful argument that one reason why universities are so committed to their openness as a spatial dynamic, that anyone can walk through the university, even today in the middle of a pandemic, is precisely because they need to stay connected with constituencies, their potential students, their former students, anyone who might have an interest in Waseda and wants to walk the campus. And one of the nicest things of being on the campus on a weekend, for example, is when you do see some elderly man or woman bringing obviously their grandkids through the Waseda campus and pointing out things that haven't changed, things that have changed. And it's a reminder of a key thing that this document discusses in the beginning, which is easy for us to forget. That when you join a university as a faculty member or as an individual, you take on a very strong identity, a associated identity, and that's very locally situated. And except for a few very famous universities like Stanford, Oxford, Cambridge, and whatnot, those identities don't carry too far beyond your local cultural context. But the very nature of the university makes you part of something much, much bigger, okay? It reaches way back into the past. All universities, in some sense, reference the legacies of the great medieval institutions in the Islamic world, some of the great madrasa of the past. One of the it's now considered one of the oldest universities in the world is in Egypt, which is a critical site of Islamic learning from the 10th century, for example. And even some of the oldest, what we would understand as universities, long gone, disappeared, unfortunately, were in Africa, even before the rise of the medieval Western university that is so much a model. But all universities, in some sense, reference the past, but are also, by definition, future-oriented. The very act of educating is future-oriented, okay? You know, the fact that I'm taking time to explain stuff here, it's an act of faith or optimism. I don't just do this because they pay me. There's a lot of people who don't do so much, even though they're getting paid. It's a kind of act of hope, you know, that will awaken some kind of interest or curiosity or whatever, and you'll be, you know, enhanced in some sense with your skill set or a perspective, which you take out into the world at large. So that's a future-oriented endeavor. Every research endeavor is future-oriented. There's just no point in doing research that people don't read that doesn't make a difference. And that's why every research indicator, every metrics talks about impact, okay? Yeah. It is completely future-oriented. And in a funny kind of thing with the universities is that constantly reference the past in order to be future-focused. And I say in the beginning of the document that effectively, as I read it to you here, historically the university is grounded in the physicality of its campus and strongly associated with it. Yet the university's imagined horizons in time and place are wide. The institution looks to the past while being future-oriented, often inhabiting awkwardly its present, okay? So we're quite awkward in its present because we're simultaneously looking over our shoulders to the past and trying to anticipate different future scenarios and to think about what we should be doing, where we should be directing our energies in terms of research and teaching. And up until just very, very recently, being thoroughly dependent on the spatiality of the institution to enable those kind of endeavors. So they're very much endeavors of imagining and communications. And that's why we're going to be doing what we're going to do. Okay, so this is effectively a kind of a straight to camera lecture without the benefits of slides, but I think that's actually better. It mirrors what I've covered in the text here. I want to stop here and we'll take a break and then we'll talk about physicality and whatnot. Someone's asked me in the chat about this will be uploaded tonight. There'll be a whole bunch of things that'll be put up in relation to the broad outline of what you'll be doing. I'll briefly speak to this now. I'm going to do that next week as well. This document will be here, and then 1 week later we're going to put a one-page steps of the project, which is kind of color by numbers, but we're very deliberately not putting it up now because we want both yourselves and the Sophia students to engage with this. You know, this is classic design thinking, you know, problem specification, problem understanding, you know, engaging with it. You'll also be assigned to your groups tonight. I've pretty much done that, and the only reason why I haven't released it so far, and 2 people, hopefully you're listening, okay. There are 2 people who, despite reminders, despite me emailing them directly, have not written to me and told me whether they want an online or a face-to-face group, and I'm kind of over them, but I don't want to have a mess subsequently and complicate the workings of other group members. So if you're listening and you haven't replied, reply to me, please. I would leave you out, except that they did the first 2 quizzes, which suggests engagement with the course. So I'm just waiting to see whether they've done the quiz today. and then going to rattle their tree if I don't hear from them. And I'm going to fix those tonight and announce your groups. You'll be able to connect with your group members through a forum on Zoom. Okay, so all of that will be there. And just, you'll have this as well, but I'll just very quickly speak to it. It's called product. Okay, you'll be a 30-slide presentation of about 10 minutes in length, pre-recorded and uploaded to YouTube. So you pre-record it through Zoom or whatever. Okay. And you'll put a reference list in as well as a separate PDF, and you'll have a what we call a diary of inquiry. Okay, so this will be it'll be concise, but it will track how you developed your project, that you didn't just shortcut, that you just went straight to the steps of the project colored by numbers and were kind of lazy, that you're iterative there. And then there'll be a PDF of any supplementary materials that you want to include. Okay, and there'll be only one submission from each group, and there's a bunch of details there, so you'll get more precise instructions. Okay, that's me, very Paul Ticking, talking at you guys at length about a critical thing. I'm excited about this project. As you see, I've thrown much more of my time and thought into developing this, frankly, than I normally do. I like developing student projects, but this one is, I think, particularly interesting and exciting because it's an impetus for you to think yourselves about where Waseda is, where it's going, where it's come from, and how that can or cannot be reconciled with the stories Waseda tells itself to the world at large. Which in some sense you benefit from, but sometimes you may sense a gap between your own experience and Waseda's self-narrative, which, as the old guy speaking, is extraordinarily common in the big world of take-it-all, lazy, bullshitting adults. Okay, we very often see organizations in particular tell stories about themselves, and I'm sure fully intending to become what they say they are, but not getting around to it. Okay, hopefully we don't come to conclusions that that's the case with Waseda.